The lake lay flat as a mirror, but there was a bright red warning sign plastered on my door: Ecological Treatment Area, no entry. I'm the homeowner, and even I didn't understand what the hell was happening. The woman, dressed like a highlighter marker explosion, stood at the bottom of my porch steps, carrying a letter that would determine the fate of the cabin 3 generations of my family had cherished. If you've ever thought HOAs were just groups of people who water plants and discuss lawn mowing schedules, well, you haven't met the version with their own legal office and cunningly orchestrated PR campaigns. Comment below and let me know where you're watching from. I'm curious how many people have faced these kinds of HOA warriors before. The morning had started peacefully enough. I'd driven up from the city after 2 months of dealing with divorce paperwork and job stress, looking forward to some quiet time by the water. My grandfather's cabin had always been my sanctuary, a place where the biggest worry was whether the fish were biting. But standing there in my boxer shorts and an old college t-shirt, staring at this official-looking warning that had appeared overnight like some bureaucratic plague, I knew my peaceful retreat was about to become anything but peaceful. The woman at my steps was wearing a hot pink power suit that hurt my eyes in the morning sun, her bleached blonde hair teased up like she was heading to a 1980s business convention. She held a manila folder thick enough to choke a horse and wore the kind of smile that screamed trouble. "Mr. Wade Carlton, I presume." Her voice carried that particular brand of false sweetness that every American has learned to fear, the tone of someone about to ruin your day with bureaucratic precision. "I'm Margaret Thornfield, chairwoman of the Lakeshore Community HOA. We need to discuss some serious environmental violations occurring on your property." She gestured dramatically at my cabin, as if it were a nuclear waste site instead of a rustic log structure that had weathered 40 years of storms without complaint. I noticed she kept glancing at a small recording device in her manicured hand, like she was documenting evidence for some grand trial. The whole scene felt orchestrated, too convenient, too prepared. This wasn't a neighborly visit about community standards. This was an ambush. I tried to keep my voice steady, though every instinct screamed that I was walking into a trap. Environmental violations? Ma'am, this cabin was built in 1983 and we've never had any issues with the county or state environmental agencies. What exactly are you claiming? Margaret's smile widened and she opened that thick folder with the flourish of a magician revealing their final trick. The papers inside looked official enough. Letterheads, stamps, signatures, the whole 9 yards. But something felt wrong about the timing, the presentation, the fact that she'd shown up at dawn like some pink-suited apocalypse horseman. She began reading from what appeared to be a formal complaint, citing violations of watershed protection laws, improper sewage disposal, and unauthorized modifications to natural water flow patterns. Each accusation was specific enough to sound credible, but vague enough that I couldn't immediately refute them. "Further," she continued, her voice gaining momentum like a prosecutor addressing a jury, "recent soil samples indicate concerning levels of contamination that pose a direct threat to our community's water supply. The HOA has expanded our jurisdiction to include all properties within the watershed protection zone, which now encompasses your grandfather's property." She paused dramatically, letting that bombshell sink in. "We're prepared to take this matter to the local news outlets if you're not willing to cooperate with our remediation requirements." The threat hung in the air like morning fog, and I felt my stomach drop. This wasn't just about property maintenance or community aesthetics. She was threatening to destroy my reputation and potentially my career as a hydrological engineer. The irony wasn't lost on me that someone was accusing an environmental engineer of environmental crimes. But Margaret didn't seem interested in irony. As she spoke, I caught a glimpse of something that made my blood run cold. A news van parked discreetly down the road, just visible through the trees. This whole confrontation was being set up for media coverage. Margaret wasn't here to resolve a dispute. She was here to create a spectacle. I forced myself to remain calm, drawing on every bit of professional training I'd ever received about dealing with hostile situations. Speaking of welcomes, there are now only 3 lawsuits in the city. Under the City Press Act, these documents were filed under HOA before responding to any of these allegations. Additionally, I'll need to verify the legitimacy of your HOA's expanded jurisdiction with the County Planning Office. Her smile faltered slightly. Apparently, she had expected me to crumble under the initial assault, but she recovered quickly, pulling out a business card with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd done this dance before. "Of course, Mr. Carlton. You have 48 hours to begin compliance measures or will be forced to escalate this matter through proper legal channels." She turned to leave, then paused as if remembering something important. Oh, and you might want to know that we've already filed preliminary complaints with the State Environmental Protection Agency. They should be in touch soon. With that parting shot, she clip-clopped down my gravel driveway in heels that had no business being on rural property, leaving me standing there with a growing sense that my life had just taken a very dark turn. As her car disappeared around the bend, I noticed the news van had vanished too, a coordination that confirmed my worst suspicions about what I was really dealing with. I went back inside and made coffee with shaking hands, trying to process what had just happened. My grandfather's cabin sat on 20 acres of pristine woodland adjacent to a state conservation area, land that had been in our family since before the HOA even existed. The idea that some newcomer organization could suddenly claim jurisdiction over property with clear grandfather clause protections seemed impossible. But as I sat on the porch, looking out over the calm lake surface, I remembered something my grandfather had told me years ago about the secret of the stream, and how this land held more power than most people realized. I'd always thought he was being poetic, talking about the spiritual connection between the land and our family. Now, I wondered if he'd been trying to tell me something far more practical and valuable. Within 24 hours, my quiet life became a digital nightmare that would make anyone question the power of modern media manipulation. Brandon Hartwell, who introduced himself as an independent environmental journalist, showed up at my temporary motel room with a camera crew and a story that had already been written before he'd even met me. The blog post, titled "Environmental Engineer Accused of Destroying Local Ecosystem," had gone live at 6 a.m., complete with photos of my cabin taken from angles that made it look suspicious and sinister. The article painted me as a hypocrite who preached environmental protection by day while poisoning watersheds by night. A narrative so perfectly crafted that I almost admired its evil efficiency. By noon, my boss at the engineering firm was calling to suggest I take voluntary leave until the situation resolved itself. Corporate speak for, "You're radioactive and we're scared." Brandon was younger than I'd expected, maybe 35, with the kind of carefully cultivated scruff and vintage flannel shirt that screamed authentic outdoor journalist. But his questions revealed someone who knew exactly what story he wanted to tell, regardless of what facts might get in the way. "Mr. Carlton, how do you respond to allegations that you've been illegally dumping sewage into protected wetlands for months?" The question was loaded with assumptions and designed to make any response sound defensive. I tried to explain that the cabin used a perfectly legal septic system that had been inspected and approved by the county just 2 years ago, but Brandon kept interrupting with follow-up questions that twisted my words. "So you admit there is sewage on your property, and you acknowledge this property borders protected wetlands." Each exchange felt like stepping deeper into quicksand, where every attempt to clarify the truth only made me look more guilty. The real genius of their strategy became clear when I started receiving phone calls from environmental groups I'd worked with professionally, asking if the allegations were true. These were people who knew my work, who'd seen my commitment to ecological protection firsthand, but even they were starting to doubt, because the story was so detailed and seemingly well-researched. Margaret and Brandon had done their homework, weaving together just enough technical terminology and regulatory citations to make their claims sound credible to anyone who didn't have specialized knowledge in watershed management. They'd turned my own expertise against me, using the complexity of environmental law to create confusion and doubt. The most frustrating part was that proving my innocence required explaining complicated hydrological systems to people who just wanted a simple answer about whether I was the bad guy or not. Social media amplified the nightmare beyond anything I could have imagined. Complete strangers were sharing the article with comments like, "This is why we can't trust anyone anymore," and "Environmental engineers are the worst hypocrites." My professional reputation, built over 15 years of careful work and ethical practice, was being destroyed by people who knew nothing about me except what they'd read in a hit piece designed to generate clicks and outrage. I found myself checking my phone obsessively, watching the story spread across platforms like wildfire, each share and comment adding another layer of public humiliation. The stress was affecting everything. I couldn't sleep, couldn't eat, couldn't focus on anything except a growing chorus of digital voices calling me a fraud and a criminal. The breaking point came when I discovered that Margaret had somehow obtained my personal cell phone number and was forwarding the online comments directly to me via text message. "Thought you'd want to see what your neighbors really think of you," followed by screenshots of the most vicious comments. It was psychological warfare designed to break me down, to make me desperate enough to sign whatever paper she wanted just to make the torment stop. But instead of breaking me, it revealed something important about Margaret's character. She wasn't content with just winning. She needed to see her enemies suffer. That vindictive streak would eventually become her downfall, but at the time, it felt like being slowly tortured by someone who enjoyed every minute of my pain. Late that evening, as I sat in my cramped motel room reading the latest wave of online attacks, I received an unexpected text from an unknown number. "Meet me at Rosie's Diner tomorrow at 7 a.m. I have information you need. Come alone. EY." I stared at the message for a long time, wondering if this was another trap or possibly the lifeline I desperately needed. Sleep didn't come easily that night, but when it did, I dreamed about my grandfather's voice, telling me that every stream has its source, and sometimes you have to go upstream to find the truth. When I woke up, I knew I had to take the risk and find out who EW was and what information they were offering. The alternative was letting Margaret and Brandon continue their character assassination until I had nothing left to lose. The woman waiting for me at Rosie's Diner looked like she hadn't slept in days, constantly glancing over her shoulder as if expecting Margaret to burst through the door at any moment. Erin Walsh introduced herself as the HOA secretary, a position she'd taken because she needed the part-time income after finishing her accounting degree. What she'd discovered in the HOA's financial records had kept her awake for weeks, wrestling with her conscience about whether to speak up or keep quiet. "Margaret isn't just targeting you because of your cabin," she whispered across the sticky Formica table, sliding a manila envelope toward me with trembling hands. "She's been systematically targeting anyone whose property sits on the underground water source that feeds the entire lake system. She has a deal with Clearwater Industries to sell them exclusive extraction rights, but she needs to control all the upstream properties first." The envelope Erin had given me contained copies of contracts, correspondence, and financial records that painted a picture of corruption so brazen it was almost impressive in its scope. Margaret hadn't just been targeting me. She'd been waging a systematic campaign against 7 different property owners whose lands sat along the underground stream system my grandfather had discovered decades ago. Each family had received similar environmental violation notices, each had been subjected to media smear campaigns, and each had eventually sold their property to the HOA at well below market value, rather than fight the legal and public relations nightmare. I was just the latest target in a scheme that had been running for almost 2 years, generating millions of dollars in profit for Margaret and her corporate partners, while destroying the lives of families who'd lived in the area for generations. The legal documents revealed that Margaret had been working with a lawyer named Thompson Bradley, a man who specialized in finding obscure environmental regulations that could be weaponized against small property owners who couldn't afford extended legal battles. They'd perfected a system, file complaints with multiple agencies simultaneously, leak selective information to friendly journalists, then offer to settle the matter quietly in exchange for property sales at panic prices. The genius of their approach was that most people would rather take a financial loss than risk their reputation and mental health, fighting allegations of environmental crimes. They were counting on my following the same pattern, breaking down under pressure and agreeing to sell rather than face the ongoing torment of public accusation and legal uncertainty. But Margaret had made one crucial mistake in targeting me. I actually understood the environmental science they were misrepresenting, and I had access to professional resources they hadn't counted on. More importantly, Erin's financial documents showed that Margaret had been falsifying environmental reports and bribing local officials to ignore proper inspection procedures. The woman who was accusing me of environmental crimes was actually guilty of far worse violations, including illegal dumping of construction waste from HOA improvement projects directly into the watershed she claimed to be protecting. The hypocrisy was staggering, but it also provided the ammunition I needed to fight back. If I could find a way to expose the truth without ending up buried under an avalanche of legal paperwork and manufactured scandals. The trap they'd set was about to snap shut when I received what appeared to be an official court order requiring me to vacate the cabin within 24 hours pending a comprehensive environmental assessment. The document looked legitimate, complete with official seals and legal language that would have fooled most people, but something about the formatting seemed off to my engineer's eye for detail. I spent 3 hours on the phone with the county clerk's office before discovering that no such order had been issued by any legitimate court. Margaret and her lawyer had created a fake legal document, gambling that I would be too intimidated or too ignorant to verify its authenticity. It was a felony fraud that could have landed them both in prison, but they were confident that their previous victims had been too broken down to fight back effectively. The fake court order was accompanied by a visit from two men in uniforms who claimed to be environmental enforcement officers, with authority to remove me from the property immediately. They arrived in an official-looking vehicle with government plates and badges that appeared legitimate at first glance. Only when I demanded to see their credentials and call their supervising agency did cracks begin to show in their performance. The officers were actually private security guards hired by Margaret's lawyer, dressed up to look like government officials and coached on how to intimidate people into compliance. When I refused to leave and threatened to call real law enforcement, they retreated quickly, but not before making it clear that this was just the opening move in what would be a very unpleasant escalation. That afternoon, Margaret orchestrated her masterstroke, a press conference on my front lawn, complete with local news cameras and a carefully selected group of concerned citizens who demanded immediate action against the environmental criminal who was poisoning their community. She stood on my property without permission in front of my grandfather's cabin and delivered a speech about protecting children and families from toxic contamination. The performance was flawless. She had facts and figures, she had emotional appeals, she had visual props, including soil samples that allegedly showed dangerous contamination levels. What she didn't have was the truth, but truth is often less compelling than a well-crafted narrative delivered by someone who believes their own lies. Watching the press conference from my motel room that evening, I felt something break inside me that had been holding back a flood of anger and determination. Margaret had crossed a line by holding her propaganda event on land that belonged to my family, by standing where my grandfather had taught me to fish and telling lies about the man who had raised me to respect and protect the natural world. She wanted to make this personal, to humiliate me not just professionally, but in the most sacred space I knew. That was her second crucial mistake, because it transformed me from a confused victim trying to defend himself into someone with nothing left to lose and every reason to fight back with everything I had. As I sat there watching her performance, I remembered my grandfather's letter about the secret of the stream and realized it was time to discover what he'd really been trying to tell me. My grandfather's letter had been hidden in a metal box inside the old stone foundation of the cabin, wrapped in oiled cloth like some treasure map from an adventure story. The pages were covered in his careful engineer's handwriting. He'd been a civil engineer for the Army Corps of Engineers before retiring to build the cabin, and they contained detailed surveys of the underground water system that fed the entire lake region. What I'd always assumed was just family property turned out to be the keystone in a hydrological system that controlled water flow for thousands of acres of surrounding land. My grandfather had discovered this back in 1985 when he was installing the cabin's well, but he'd kept the information secret because he understood how dangerous it could be in the wrong hands. The technical drawings were beautiful in their precision, showing not just the main underground stream but dozens of tributaries, natural cisterns, and what my grandfather called pressure release points scattered throughout the area. He'd spent years mapping the system, using his engineering expertise to understand how seasonal rains and snowmelt traveled through limestone caverns and emerged as springs that fed the lake and surrounding wetlands. The cabin wasn't just built on the water source, it was positioned at a crucial junction where three major underground streams converged before flowing toward the lake. Anyone who controlled this junction could potentially control the entire regional water supply, a fact that made Margaret's interest in the property suddenly make terrifying sense. But my grandfather had done more than just map the water system. He designed what he called natural controls that could redirect water flow if the system was ever threatened by development or contamination. Hidden throughout the property were carefully placed stones, modified drain systems, and what looked like random landscaping but were actually engineered solutions that could channel water along different paths. It was like discovering that my quiet family retreat was actually the control room for a vast underground network that most people didn't even know existed. The implications were staggering. If Margaret gained control of the property, she wouldn't just be able to sell water extraction rights to Clearwater Industries. She'd be able to manipulate the entire regional water supply to maximize profits regardless of environmental consequences. Calvin Dorsey, the retired plumber who lived 2 properties over, had been waiting 40 years for someone from the Carlton family to ask the right questions about the underground stream system. When I showed up at his door with my grandfather's drawings, his weathered face lit up like Christmas morning. Your granddad swore me to secrecy, but I figured after he passed, someone in the family should know the truth, he said, leading me to his basement where he'd kept his own set of records documenting the local water system. That woman Margaret doesn't have a clue what she's really messing with, but if she keeps interfering with the natural drainage patterns, she's going to flood half the county and dry up the other half. Calvin's records showed that Margaret's improvements to the HOA properties had already begun disrupting natural water flow in dangerous ways. The decorative ponds and underground irrigation systems she'd installed were intersecting the natural streams and redirecting water in patterns that could lead to catastrophic flooding during heavy rains. Even worse, the construction waste from her projects was contaminating the groundwater with chemicals that would eventually poison the entire lake system. She's been dumping concrete, rubble, and construction debris into natural sinkholes because she thinks they're just random holes in the ground, Calvin explained, showing me photographs he'd taken of illegal dumping sites on HOA property. But those sinkholes are actually natural pressure relief valves for the underground stream system. Block them up, and the water has to go somewhere else. The most damaging revelation was that Margaret had been deliberately manipulating water flow to create the appearance of environmental problems on target properties. The contamination she'd detected on my land was actually runoff from her own illegal dumping, channeled through modified drainage systems to make it appear that the pollution was coming from my septic system. She'd essentially been framing property owners for environmental crimes while committing far worse violations herself, a level of calculated deception that went beyond simple fraud into something approaching environmental terrorism. The evidence Calvin had gathered over months of careful documentation would be enough to destroy Margaret's reputation and potentially send her to prison, but only if we could find a way to present it without becoming targets of her legal and media machine. As we pored over the maps and photographs, I began to understand the true scope of what my grandfather had left me. The cabin wasn't just a family retreat. It was a responsibility to protect one of the most important hydrological systems in the region. The underground streams didn't just feed the lake. They provided drinking water for 3 different communities, supported wetlands that prevented flooding during storm seasons, and maintained the ecological balance for thousands of acres of forest and farmland. Margaret's scheme to sell extraction rights would eventually destroy all of that, turning a thriving ecosystem into a drained wasteland while generating short-term profits for corporate investors, who would never have to live with the environmental consequences. The final piece of the puzzle came from an unexpected source. Brandon Hartwell, the journalist who'd been attacking me in print, showed up at Calvin's house looking nervous and defeated. He'd discovered that his editor had been taking payments from a PR firm connected to Clearwater Industries, and that his independent environmental journalism was actually part of an orchestrated campaign to manufacture public support for Margaret's land grab. "I thought I was exposing environmental crimes," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "But I've been helping cover up real environmental destruction while destroying innocent people's lives. I want to make this right. But I need protection because these people have already threatened my career and my family." The hunter had become the hunted, and suddenly I had an unexpected ally with access to the same media networks that had been used to destroy my reputation. With Brandon's inside knowledge of Margaret's media strategy and Calvin's documentation of her environmental crimes, I finally had the ammunition needed to fight back against the machine that had been systematically destroying my life. But instead of rushing into a direct confrontation that would give Margaret and her lawyers time to cover their tracks, I decided to use her own tactics against her: patient preparation, strategic timing, and the element of surprise. My grandfather's maps showed exactly how to restore the natural water flow patterns that Margaret had disrupted, and my engineering background gave me the knowledge to implement changes that would look like routine maintenance while actually preparing a trap that would expose her crimes when she least expected it. The first step was quietly documenting every illegal modification Margaret had made to the natural drainage systems on HOA properties. Working at night with Calvin as my guide and Brandon providing intelligence about Margaret's schedule, we photographed dumping sites, measured water contamination levels, and created a comprehensive record of environmental violations that would stand up in any court or regulatory hearing. The work was dangerous because Margaret had hired private security to patrol the HOA properties, but Calvin knew every trail and hiding spot from decades of walking these woods, and we managed to gather evidence without being detected. Each photograph and water sample was another nail in the coffin Margaret had built for herself through years of arrogant disregard for environmental law. The engineering solution was elegant in its simplicity. By removing a few strategically placed stones and opening some blocked drainage channels, I could restore the natural water flow that had existed before Margaret's improvements began disrupting the system. The changes would be invisible to casual observation, but would have dramatic effects during the next heavy rainfall, when water that had been artificially diverted would return to its original channels through Margaret's property. My grandfather had designed the system to be self-regulating, so all I had to do was remove the artificial barriers that were preventing it from functioning naturally. It wasn't vandalism or environmental terrorism, it was ecological restoration, returning a damaged system to its original state. But the real genius of the plan was psychological rather than technical. Margaret's entire scheme depended on maintaining the illusion that she was an environmental protector, fighting against polluters and criminals. Once her own property was flooded with contaminated water from her illegal dumping sites, she would either have to admit that she'd been lying about the source of environmental problems, or she'd have to continue the charade while standing ankle-deep in toxic runoff from her own violations. Either choice would destroy her credibility and expose the contradiction at the heart of her entire operation. She'd built her power on convincing people that she was protecting them from environmental threats, while actually creating far worse problems behind the scenes. The timing had to be perfect, coordinated with both natural weather patterns and Margaret's public relations schedule. Brandon's intelligence network revealed that she was planning a major press event to announce the successful remediation of environmental problems in the HOA area, complete with staged water quality tests and testimonials from grateful residents. The irony was delicious. She would be celebrating her environmental protection efforts just as contaminated water from her own illegal activities flooded the very properties she claimed to have cleaned up. We scheduled the drainage modifications for 3 days before her planned press conference, giving the water system time to equilibrate, but not enough time for her to figure out what had happened and respond effectively. Aaron Walsh provided the final piece of intelligence we needed: detailed schedules for Margaret's security patrols and the locations of surveillance cameras on HOA properties. Her access to administrative records also revealed that Margaret had been falsifying water quality reports for months, submitting fake data to environmental regulators to cover up contamination from her construction projects. This pattern of systematic fraud would make it impossible for her to claim that any flooding or contamination was accidental or unforeseeable. She'd known about the problems all along and had been actively concealing them from authorities. When the truth came out, it wouldn't just be environmental violations. It would be conspiracy to defraud government agencies and endanger public health. The night we implemented the plan felt like a military operation, with each team member knowing exactly what to do and when to do it. Calvin guided us through the woods using paths he'd walked for 40 years. Brandon documented our activities to prove we were only removing artificial barriers rather than creating new ones, and I used my engineering expertise to make surgical modifications that would restore natural water flow without causing immediate flooding. We worked by moonlight with minimal equipment, removing strategic stones and clearing blocked channels that would allow the underground stream system to function as my grandfather had originally intended. By dawn, the work was complete, and the only evidence of our presence was the absence of artificial barriers that should never have been there in the first place. As we walked back through the pre-dawn darkness, I felt a connection to my grandfather that I hadn't experienced since childhood. Not just the emotional bond of shared memories, but the practical partnership of engineers working together across generations to solve a complex problem. He'd given me the knowledge and tools I needed to protect the land and water that had sustained our family for decades. But more than that, he'd taught me that sometimes the most powerful action is the patient removal of obstacles that prevent natural systems from healing themselves. Margaret had built her empire by creating artificial problems and selling expensive solutions, but the truth was often simpler and more elegant than the lies that obscured it. The first drops of rain began falling on Tuesday morning, gentle and warm, the kind of spring shower that normally would have made me want to sit on the cabin porch with a cup of coffee and watch the lake surface dimple with tiny circles. But this wasn't a normal morning, and this wasn't going to be a normal rainstorm. The Weather Service had been predicting a major front moving through the region, the kind of system that would dump 3 to 4 inches of rain over 24 hours, exactly the conditions needed to fully test the restored water flow patterns we'd carefully engineered 3 days earlier. Margaret had no idea that her perfectly manicured HOA properties were about to become ground zero for a demonstration of what happens when you ignore natural hydrological systems for too long. By noon, the gentle shower had intensified into a steady downpour that sent streams of water cascading down hillsides and filling the underground channels that had been blocked for almost 2 years. From my motel room window, I could see the lake level rising steadily as runoff from the surrounding watershed poured into the natural collection system that my grandfather had mapped so carefully decades ago. The engineering was working exactly as designed. Water that had been artificially diverted was finding its way back to original channels, carrying with it accumulated sediment and contamination from Margaret's illegal dumping sites. The reckoning was beginning, and there was no way to stop what we'd set in motion without admitting the truth about what had been hidden beneath the surface of HOA respectability. The first emergency call came at 2:30 p.m., when water began bubbling up through the decorative stone pathways in Margaret's prize-winning garden, carrying with it a distinctive chemical smell that suggested something far more toxic than natural groundwater. By 3 o'clock, the basement of the HOA community center was flooded with 6 inches of contaminated water that made the building uninhabitable and forced Margaret to relocate her planned press conference to the local library. The irony was perfect. She'd been prepared to celebrate her environmental protection efforts while standing on property that was literally leaking toxic waste from her own illegal activities. The natural water system was essentially conducting its own investigation, bringing evidence of Margaret's crimes to the surface where it couldn't be hidden or denied. Brandon was on site with his camera equipment, documenting everything for what would become the most important story of his journalism career. A real environmental investigation instead of the manufactured scandal he'd been tricked into promoting. The footage he captured was devastating. Water bubbling up through sidewalks, contaminated runoff flowing across children's playgrounds, and Margaret herself standing in ankle-deep toxic water while trying to maintain her composure for the television cameras that had gathered to cover what was supposed to be a triumphant press conference. Her pink power suit was stained with muddy water that carried the chemical signature of construction waste and illegal dumping, a visual metaphor for the corruption that had been hidden beneath her polished public image. The Environmental Protection Agency arrived within hours of the first reports of contaminated groundwater, not because they'd been investigating Margaret's activities, but because multiple residents had called to report strange chemical odors and discolored water emerging from storm drains throughout the HOA area. The EPA investigators were experienced professionals who knew how to trace contamination to its source, and it didn't take long for them to identify the illegal dumping sites that Calvin and I had documented weeks earlier. What made the situation even worse for Margaret was that she'd been filing false reports with these same EPA officials for months, claiming that all environmental issues in the area had been resolved and that water quality testing showed no problem. Now they were standing in contaminated water that proved she'd been lying to federal regulators while covering up serious environmental crimes. The media circus that followed was everything Margaret had orchestrated against me, but in reverse. And this time, the accusations were backed up by physical evidence that couldn't be explained away with legal technicalities or character assassination. Television reporters stood in flooded HOA properties, interviewing residents who were being evacuated from homes contaminated by toxic runoff from Margaret's construction projects. Environmental scientists collected water samples that would eventually reveal dangerous levels of heavy metals, petroleum products, and industrial chemicals that had been dumped into natural sinkholes over a period of years. The story wrote itself. A corrupt HOA chairwoman who had been poisoning her own community while falsely accusing innocent property owners of environmental crimes. The final blow came when Erin Walsh emerged from hiding with her carefully organized financial records, providing prosecutors with a paper trail that connected Margaret's environmental crimes to a broader pattern of fraud and corruption. The documents showed systematic bribery of local officials, falsification of government reports, and conspiracy to defraud property owners through manufactured environmental violations. Margaret hadn't just been covering up illegal dumping. She'd been operating a criminal enterprise that generated profits by destroying families and poisoning the environment she claimed to protect. The evidence was so comprehensive that even her high-powered legal team couldn't construct a plausible defense, especially when their client was literally standing in toxic waste from her own illegal activities. As evening fell and the rain finally began to subside, I drove past the HOA properties one last time before returning to my grandfather's cabin. The natural water system had reached a new equilibrium, with contaminated runoff contained in temporary retention areas, while EPA crews worked to prevent further environmental damage. Margaret's perfect community looked like a disaster zone, with yellow hazmat tape stretched across flooded properties and environmental specialists in protective suits collecting evidence of crimes that could no longer be hidden. The underground streams were flowing in their original channels for the first time in years, carrying away the artificial barriers that had allowed corruption to fester in darkness. My grandfather would have been proud to see natural justice finally flowing as freely as the water he'd spent his life protecting. The legal proceedings that followed were swift and decisive in a way that environmental cases rarely are, mainly because Margaret's crimes were so well documented and so blatantly obvious that even the most corporate-friendly judge couldn't ignore the evidence. The EPA's investigation revealed contamination levels that posed immediate threats to public health, forcing the evacuation of 12 families and the closure of 2 schools until comprehensive cleanup could be completed. Margaret found herself facing federal charges for environmental crimes, mail fraud, conspiracy to defraud government agencies, and racketeering, a legal avalanche that her expensive lawyers couldn't prevent or redirect. The woman who'd tried to destroy my life with false environmental accusations was now facing 20 years in federal prison for actual environmental crimes that had endangered an entire community. The financial penalties were equally devastating. Margaret was ordered to pay $2.7 million in cleanup costs, plus additional damages to the families who'd been displaced by her illegal activities. The HOA itself was dissolved after investigators discovered that its entire operational budget had been funded through fraudulent property seizures and kickbacks from corporate partners. Clearwater Industries faced its own federal investigation for conspiracy and bribery, with company executives distancing themselves from Margaret as quickly as possible once the extent of her criminal activities became public knowledge. The entire corruption network that had seemed so powerful and untouchable just weeks earlier collapsed like a house of cards, once the truth was finally exposed to daylight. But victory came with its own complications and moral ambiguities that I hadn't anticipated during the heat of battle. The flooding that exposed Margaret's crimes had also damaged some properties belonging to innocent residents who'd had no knowledge of the illegal activities happening beneath their feet. Several families lost personal belongings and had to relocate temporarily while their homes were decontaminated, making me question whether my actions had been justified, even though they'd revealed crucial evidence of environmental crimes. The line between justice and revenge is thinner than most people realize, and I found myself wondering if I'd crossed it in my determination to stop Margaret from destroying more lives and poisoning more communities. The media attention that followed was intense but surprisingly fair, with most reporters recognizing that I'd been the victim of a systematic fraud rather than the environmental criminal I'd been portrayed as during Margaret's smear campaign. Brandon Hartwell wrote a comprehensive expose that won him a state journalism award and helped restore my professional reputation. But he also included thoughtful analysis of how legitimate environmental concerns can be weaponized by corrupt individuals for personal gain. The story became a cautionary tale about the importance of verifying environmental claims and holding all parties accountable to the same scientific standards, regardless of their political positions or public relations strategies. My engineering firm welcomed me back with apologies and a promotion that came with increased responsibility for environmental oversight on major projects. The irony wasn't lost on me that fighting false accusations of environmental crimes had actually enhanced my credentials as an environmental engineer. But I also recognized that not everyone falsely accused of such crimes would have the technical knowledge and resources necessary to defend themselves effectively. Margaret's strategy of targeting isolated property owners with complex environmental accusations would have been completely successful against victims who lacked specialized knowledge and professional connections. The system that had eventually delivered justice for me was still vulnerable to manipulation by people smart enough to avoid Margaret's obvious mistake. The cleanup of the contaminated sites took 8 months and cost taxpayers over $4 million. Money that could have been spent on legitimate environmental protection projects instead of fixing damage caused by criminal negligence and fraud. Margaret served 18 months in federal prison before being released on probation, during which time she lost her home, her savings, and her reputation in the community she'd tried to control. She moved to another state after her release, presumably to start over somewhere that her criminal record wouldn't be common knowledge. I occasionally wondered if she'd learned anything from the experience, or if she was simply looking for new opportunities to exploit environmental concerns for personal gain. The most lasting impact was on my relationship with my grandfather's property and the responsibilities that came with it. I'd inherited more than just a cabin and 20 acres of woodland. I'd inherited stewardship of a hydrological system that affected thousands of people who would never know my name or understand the role I played in protecting their water supply. The underground streams continued to flow in their natural channels, supporting wetlands and wildlife habitats that had been threatened by Margaret's interference with natural drainage patterns. I established a small environmental monitoring station in the cabin's basement, collecting data that would help scientists understand how underground water systems respond to climate change and development pressure. The final chapter of the story came 2 years later when I received a letter from another property owner in a different state who was facing similar environmental accusations from a newly formed HOA with suspiciously familiar tactics. The name was different, but the pattern was identical. Manufactured environmental violations, media smear campaigns, and pressure to sell property at below-market prices to resolve fabricated problems. I spent a weekend helping them organize their defense and connect with legitimate environmental scientists who could verify the false nature of the accusations against them. It occurred to me that Margaret might have been part of a larger network of people who specialized in this particular type of fraud. But that investigation would have to wait for someone else with more time and resources than I had available. As I write this, sitting on the porch of my grandfather's cabin and watching the lake reflect the sunset, I'm struck by how much my understanding of justice and environmental protection has evolved through this experience. The truth is that protecting the environment requires protecting it from everyone who would exploit it for personal gain, whether they're corporate polluters, corrupt officials, or activists who manufacture crises for profit and power. My grandfather understood that stewardship isn't just about preserving natural systems. It's about preventing people from manipulating those systems for purposes that have nothing to do with genuine environmental protection. The underground streams continue to flow, carrying with them the memory of everything that happens on the surface, washing away the artificial barriers that prevent natural systems from healing themselves, and providing clean water for communities that will never know how close they came to losing something irreplaceable to the schemes of people who saw environmental protection as just another business opportunity.